Hello, my friend, and welcome to the Sleepy Scholar. Tonight we are going somewhere very quiet. Not a place exactly, but a feeling, the feeling of standing in a room where thousands of years have been folded gently into shelves, where the breath of long-gone readers still seems to hang in the air like dust caught in a slant of afternoon light. Tonight's subject is the ancient library. Not a building, not really. Think of it instead as a kind of second memory for the human species, a place where a civilization decided, quietly and stubbornly, that it did not want to forget itself. A library is a mind that does not sleep, built by people who did. Somewhere, in a dry, quiet room, that fold has been sitting patiently for thousands of years, waiting for someone tired enough and curious enough to finally wander in. If you have had a long day, and perhaps you have, you do not need to have any energy left for this. You don't need curiosity tonight, or focus, or the will to learn anything at all. Some nights we want fireworks. Tonight is not that kind of night. Tonight, you might simply prefer the company of old stone corridors and older stories, murmured slowly, rather than counting sheep in the dark. That is enough. That is exactly enough. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight. We are going to wander gently through several thousand years of shelves and scrolls and clay tablets, at no particular pace, with no particular destination. You do not need to keep track of the order. You do not need to remember a single name. If your mind drifts away entirely and comes back 20 minutes later, it will not have missed anything that matters. This is a walk, not a lecture. And if these gentle journeys ever help you rest, you're welcome to like or subscribe, not because it changes anything for us, but because it helps other sleepy souls find their way here too, on some other tired night of their own. So let's begin by putting the day down. Let your body soften first, not all at once, just a little, wherever you happen to be holding on. Maybe it's your shoulders. Let them drop just slightly, away from your ears. Maybe it's your jaw. Let it unclench. Let your teeth come apart. Let your tongue rest heavy in your mouth. Let your breathing slow down on its own time, no need to force it. In and a little longer out. There is nothing to prepare for. There is nothing to solve tonight. You don't need to remember anything I say. You don't need to follow the thread if it slips away from you. It will still be here, gently waiting, whether you're listening closely or drifting off entirely. Nothing here is a test. There will be no questions later. This is not a task. It is simply a place for your mind to rest its weight for a while, the way a tired hand finally uncurls. Your mind, after all, spends its days trying to predict what comes next, turning every sound and thought into a guess about the future. That's its job, and it does it well, even when it's exhausted. So tonight, let this slow voice do some of that guessing for you. Let it know that what comes next is simply more quiet, more softness, Nothing sharp, nothing urgent, just this. So let your mind drift as we begin. Long before anyone called a room a library, there were rooms full of clay. In the river valleys of ancient Sumer, thousands of years before papyrus or parchment existed, people pressed reed styluses into wet clay to keep track of grain, sheep, and debts. Somewhere along the way, this humble bookkeeping became something more. Temples at cities like Nippur began storing tablets not just for accounts, but for hymns, stories, and lists of kings. These were some of the very first libraries, rooms of baked earth, holding the memory of a civilization in the shape of thumbprints and wedge marks, drying slowly in the sun. Imagine that. The first libraries were not built to be beautiful. They were built the way a person quietly saves old letters in a drawer, without any plan for who might read them later. And yet here we are, all these thousands of years afterward, still able to read what a Sumerian scribe once pressed into soft clay on an ordinary afternoon. Some quiet part of you tonight is doing something similar, pressing today gently into memory, without needing to know what will be kept and what will fade. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Fire, strangely enough, was not always the enemy of memory. Around 650 BCE, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal built an enormous library in the city of Nineveh. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, gathered from every corner of his empire on subjects ranging from medicine to omens to epic poetry. When enemies eventually burned the city to the ground, the fire did something unexpected. Rather than destroying the tablets, it baked them, hardening the clay the way a kiln hardens pottery. The very disaster that ended the library preserved its contents for nearly 26 centuries, buried and waiting. When archaeologists finally uncovered the ruins in the 19th century, they found room after room of tablets still legible, the ash of the fire lying over them like a blanket. Ashurbanipal himself once boasted, in an inscription on one of his own tablets, that he had learned to read the most difficult cuneiform of his time, that he treasured the wisdom of the scribes above gold. Somewhere in that boast is something almost tender. A powerful king who wanted, more than anything, to be remembered as someone who loved to read. Tonight, whatever you've read or learned or wondered about in your life is also part of you, quietly baked in, safe from being lost. But that is only one small part of the story. Across the Mediterranean, in a city built by a Macedonian general on the edge of Egypt, a very different kind of library was taking shape. Alexandria, founded in 331 BCE, became home to the most famous library the ancient world would ever know. It was not simply a room of scrolls. It was closer to a research institute attached to a building called the Mauseon, a shrine to the Muses, where scholars lived, ate, and were paid a salary simply to think. Ptolemy I, and later his son, wanted Alexandria to become the intellectual center of the known world, and for a while, it very nearly was. Poets, mathematicians, doctors, and astronomers gathered under one roof, supported not to produce anything in particular, but simply to study. There is something quietly moving in that idea, a place where thinking itself was considered valuable enough to fund, with no immediate use required. Tonight, your own mind doesn't need to produce anything either. It can simply be unhurried, the way those old scholars were once allowed to simply wonder. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The Library of Alexandria did not wait patiently for books to arrive. It went looking for them. According to ancient accounts, every ship that docked in the harbor of Alexandria was searched for scrolls. If a ship carried texts the library did not yet own, the scrolls were confiscated, copied by hand, and only the copies were returned to the original owners. The library kept the originals for itself. These borrowed and never returned scrolls were sometimes nicknamed the ship's books. A whole shelf built from the accidental generosity of travelers who never meant to donate anything at all. It's a strange, almost mischievous kind of hunger for knowledge. A city so eager to hold onto every fragment of writing that passed through its harbor that it was willing to bend the rules of ownership completely. Somewhere in that story is a reminder that curiosity, when it's genuine, doesn't always ask politely. Tonight, you don't need to ask permission to let your thoughts drift wherever they'd like to go. But that is only one small part of the story. Before the internet, before card catalogs, before even the idea of a library index, someone had to invent the very first one. His name was Callimachus, a poet and scholar working at Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, and he faced an almost unimaginable problem. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls, with no reliable way to find any particular one. His solution was a set of reference lists called the Pinax, tables that organized authors by subject, listed their works, noted how many lines each scroll contained, and even included short biographical notes. It was, in essence, the first library catalog in recorded history, an attempt to make an overwhelming ocean of information feel searchable, walkable, held. There's a certain comfort in imagining someone so long ago quietly sorting an impossible pile of information into something calm and orderly, one scroll at a time, patient and unhurried. Tonight, your own mind doesn't need to sort anything. It can let all its scattered scrolls simply lie where they are, unlabeled, unbothered. There's something else worth letting settle for a moment. Two great libraries once competed so fiercely that their rivalry accidentally invented a new material. Alexandria's great rival was the city of Pergamon, whose kings were also building an enormous library of their own. As the story is told, Egypt, worried about Pergamon's growing collection, placed an embargo on papyrus exports, since papyrus reeds grew almost exclusively along the Nile. Cut off from their usual writing material, the scholars of Pergamon are said to have refined a new surface for writing, treated animal skin, scraped thin and smoothed until it could hold ink beautifully. This material eventually took its name from the city itself, Pergamna, which became, in English, parchment. Whether every detail of that story is precisely true has been debated by historians for centuries, but the shape of it remains lovely regardless, a shortage turning, almost stubbornly, into an invention. Tonight, if your mind feels short on quiet, let it invent its own version of stillness, however it needs to. But that is only one small part of the story. Not every ancient library survived by being protected. Some survived by being buried. In the Roman town of Herculaneum, a private library once sat inside a grand seaside villa known today as the Villa of the Papyri. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, the pyroclastic heat did something almost impossible. Instead of burning the scrolls to ash, it carbonized them, turning each one into a fragile black cylinder of solid carbon, still holding the shape of writing inside. For centuries, these scrolls sat in museum drawers, too brittle to unroll, their words seemingly lost forever inside blackened husks. Only recently, using CT scanners and artificial intelligence to trace the faint texture of ink beneath carbonized layers, have researchers begun reading words from these scrolls without ever physically opening them, coaxing sentences out of objects that looked, for nearly 2,000 years, like nothing more than lumps of charcoal. There is something remarkable in that patience, that willingness to wait centuries for the right gentle tool to finally arrive. Whatever feels sealed away in you tonight doesn't need to be opened all at once either. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Some of the oldest libraries in the world were not built to store stories at all, but to store the sky. Many of the tablets in Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh were not myths or poems, but careful, methodical records of omens, the positions of planets, the behavior of animals, the shapes clouds made, all cataloged in an effort to predict what the future might hold. Assyrian scholars believed the world could be read the way a text is read, if only you gathered enough observations and organized them carefully enough. Libraries, in this sense, were not just archives of the past. They were early, hopeful attempts to make the future feel a little less uncertain. There's something very human in that impulse, collecting information, not to show off, but simply to feel a little safer in an unpredictable world. Tonight, you don't need to predict anything. The morning will arrive on its own, exactly as it always has. But that is only one small part of the story. Not every great library belonged to kings or emperors. Some belonged to entire generations of ordinary families, hidden in plain sight. In the city of Timbuktu, in what is now Mali, centuries of scholars gathered and copied manuscripts on astronomy, law, medicine, and poetry, building one of the richest written traditions in West Africa. When the region faced periods of unrest and threat, many of these manuscripts were not moved to museums or vaults. They were quietly hidden in family homes, buried in trunks, sewn into the walls, tucked beneath floorboards, protected for generations by people who were never trained librarians, only caretakers of memory. There's something deeply moving about a library that survives not through grand architecture, but through the quiet devotion of ordinary hands, generation after generation, refusing to let something slip away. Whatever you've quietly carried and protected in your own life, tonight can finally set its weight down for a while. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. A single line carved above a doorway may be the oldest description of what a library actually feels like from the inside. Above the entrance to one of the chambers at Ramesses II's temple library in Egypt, ancient sources describe an inscription that translates, roughly, to the healing place of the soul. The Egyptians called their libraries and archives the house of life, Parank. And these were not simply storage rooms tucked away from daily life. They were attached to temples, staffed by priest scribes who copied medical texts, religious hymns, and magical formulas side by side, treating knowledge itself as something sacred enough to require its own quiet, protected room. Think about that phrase for a moment, the healing place of the soul. Somewhere, thousands of years ago, someone decided that a room full of careful, patient writing could actually mend something inside a tired person. Perhaps that instinct was not so different from what brought you here tonight, looking for a quiet room built from old words, hoping something in you might settle because of it. But that is only one small part of the story. The scrolls in an ancient library did not simply sit on shelves the way books do today. They lived inside little wooden cases, like patients resting in individual beds. A papyrus scroll was rolled around a central rod called an umbilicus, and to keep hundreds of thousands of these cylindrical scrolls from becoming an unsearchable tangle, librarians attached small tags called syllaboi to the outside edge, each one noting the title and author in a few careful words. Shelves were divided into pigeonholed cubbies, each scroll resting on its side like a sleeping creature curled into its own small alcove, waiting patiently to be chosen. There's something oddly tender about that image, thousands of rolled up stories, each one labeled gently and tucked into its own resting place, in no hurry to be read. You don't need to be read or opened or unrolled tonight either. You can simply rest in your own small alcove of the evening, however curled up and quiet that looks. There is something else worth letting settle for a moment. Ancient librarians fought a slow, invisible war against a very small enemy, the insect. Papyrus and parchment were both, in their own way, delicious to certain beetles, silverfish, and moths. And ancient caretakers developed careful defenses against them. Texts mention rubbing scrolls with cedar oil, a fragrant, slightly bitter resin that insects avoided, both preserving the material and filling reading rooms with a warm, woody scent. To walk into an ancient library, by some accounts, was to be greeted first by that smell, cedar and dust, and the faint mineral tang of ink, before a single word was ever read. It's easy to forget that libraries were not just visual places, full of scrolls to look at, but full sensory worlds, the creak of a wooden case, the whisper of parchment against skin, that particular cedar warmth in the air. Let yourself imagine that smell now, cedar and quiet dust, settling gently around you, asking nothing of you at all. But that is only one small part of the story. Long after the fires and the crumbling walls, historians are still gently arguing about what actually happened to the Library of Alexandria. For centuries, popular stories placed the blame on a single dramatic event. A fire started by Julius Caesar's soldiers, or a sudden destruction by religious zealots, or a single catastrophic raid. Modern historians, working carefully through fragments of evidence, now believe the truth was slower and less cinematic. The library likely declined gradually over centuries through a combination of reduced funding, political instability, several smaller fires, and the simple, unglamorous erosion of neglect. No single villain, no single tragic night, just time quietly doing what time does. There is something almost comforting in that correction. The idea that even the most legendary loss in history wasn't one dramatic collapse, but a slow, ordinary fading, the kind that happens to nearly everything eventually, without any grand explanation needed. Whatever feels unfinished or fading in your own life tonight doesn't need a dramatic ending either. It can simply, slowly soften. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. At the heart of Alexandria's great library was a very ordinary, very human obsession: getting the story right. Ancient poems like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey had been copied and recopied by hand for centuries before Alexandria, drifting slowly out of agreement with each other. A line added here, a word changed there, small errors multiplying quietly across generations of scribes. The way a whispered message changes as it passes down a long line of people. The scholars at Alexandria took on the patient task of comparing dozens of different copies side by side, line by line, trying to reconstruct something closer to the original, correcting what they believed were mistakes and marking passages they weren't certain about with small symbols in the margins. In doing so, without quite meaning to, they invented something we now call textual criticism, the careful art of restoring a story to something closer to its truest shape. There is something quietly moving in imagining a scholar working by lamplight, comparing two slightly different versions of the same ancient poem, gently trying to decide which word was truer, which line more faithful to what was first meant. Some part of your own mind, tonight, might be doing something similar without noticing, quietly comparing the version of today you were handed against the version you'd rather remember, and slowly, gently, choosing which one to let settle. But that is only one small part of the story. One of history's most famous acts of measurement happened not with satellites or instruments of extraordinary precision, but with a stick, a shadow, and a very patient scholar working from inside a library. Eratosthenes, a librarian at Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, heard that at a certain time of year, in a certain southern city, the sun cast no shadow at noon at all. It shone straight down a deep well. On that same day, in Alexandria, he measured the angle of a shadow cast by a vertical stick, and using nothing more than that angle, a rough sense of distance between the two cities, and careful geometry, he calculated the circumference of the entire earth. His estimate came astonishingly close to the true measurement we know today, achieved entirely from inside a library, using little more than curiosity, sunlight, and patience. There is something breathtaking about that, a person sitting quietly with a problem, working it through with nothing but attentive thought, arriving at the true size of the whole world. You don't need any instruments tonight either. Just the quiet size of your own breathing in and a little longer out is more than enough. There is something else worth letting settle for a moment. A single geometry textbook written by a librarian at Alexandria would go on to become one of the most reprinted and recopied books in human history. Euclid, working in Alexandria around 300 BCE, gathered together the mathematical knowledge of his time into a work called the Elements, a patient, step-by-step walk through geometry, built from simple, careful definitions and slowly stacked, one proof resting gently on the proof before it. For well over 2,000 years, students learned geometry from versions of this same text, an unbroken thread of teaching reaching from a quiet Alexandrian scholar all the way to classrooms of the modern world. There's something soothing in that image, an idea built with such patient, careful footing that it simply continued being true, generation after generation, needing no revision to its foundations. Whatever feels shaky in your own thoughts tonight doesn't need to be solved. It can simply rest, one small, unhurried step at a time, the way Euclid built his proofs. But that is only one small part of the story. Not every library in the ancient world stored words. Some stored formulas, remedies, and the accumulated trial and error of generations of healers. Among the thousands of tablets recovered from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, a significant portion were medical texts, lists of symptoms paired carefully with treatments, diagnostic texts that tried to link certain illnesses to certain causes, and long series of remedies passed down from healer to healer, refined slowly over centuries of careful observation. Some of these medical tablets read almost like a very old, very patient conversation between doctor and patient, written down so that the next healer, and the one after that, would not have to start from nothing. A person suffering from a fever, or a wound, or a troubled stomach in ancient Assyria could be treated using knowledge gathered from healers who had died centuries earlier, their careful notes still quietly doing their work long after they themselves were gone. There's a particular kind of comfort in that continuity, the idea that someone, somewhere, long ago, sat with the same discomfort you might feel tonight and wrote down what helped, so that a total stranger centuries later might feel a little less alone in it. Whatever discomfort you're carrying tonight, know that countless others before you have carried something like it too, and found their way, slowly, toward rest. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Long after the fall of Rome, when so much of the ancient world's writing seemed at risk of disappearing entirely, a very quiet kind of library kept the thread from breaking. In monasteries scattered across medieval Europe, monks worked in rooms called scriptoria, copying manuscripts by hand, not only religious texts, but many surviving works of ancient Greek and Roman literature, science, and philosophy, without any expectation of fame or reward, working in near silence for hours at a time. These copyists preserved fragile threads of ancient thought purely through repetition. Letter by letter, page by page, century after century. Many of the classical texts we can still read today exist only because some patient, anonymous monk chose to spend a portion of his quiet life copying someone else's words, simply because he believed they were worth saving. There's something deeply moving in that kind of devotion, care given not for recognition, but simply because something mattered and someone, somewhere, decided it shouldn't be allowed to vanish. Whatever quiet, unglamorous care you've given to something in your own life, a person, a memory, a small daily habit matters in that same unnoticed way. It is doing its work, even in the dark, even when no one is watching. But that is only one small part of the story. While Europe's libraries were quietly rebuilding themselves one monastery at a time, a different city, far to the east, was assembling one of the greatest centers of learning the world had yet seen. In Baghdad, during the 8th and 9th centuries, the Abbasid caliphs founded an institution known as the House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, where scholars gathered to translate Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, preserving works of philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy that might otherwise have been lost entirely to time. Scholars of many backgrounds and faiths worked side by side, and through their careful translations, ideas from ancient Greece were passed forward, eventually flowing back into medieval Europe centuries later, carried along an unbroken chain of careful, patient hands. It's worth sitting with that image for a moment. An idea born in one language, in one distant century, surviving only because someone, somewhere along an impossibly long chain of translators and copyists, decided it was worth carrying just a little further. You don't need to carry anything tonight. You can simply let the chain rest here safely for now. There is something else worth letting settle for a moment. Some of the greatest libraries in history were never really about books at all. They were about universities, long before that word existed. At Nalanda, in what is now northeastern India, a Buddhist monastic university flourished for roughly 7 centuries, drawing students from as far away as China, Korea, and Central Asia. At its height, the library complex is said to have held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts across several tall buildings, and thousands of students and teachers lived and studied there together, debating philosophy and medicine and logic in courtyards shaded from the heat. When invading forces destroyed Nalanda in the 12th century, later accounts claim the library burned for months, its manuscripts too numerous for the fire to consume all at once. There's something almost unbearable in that image, and something quietly beautiful too. A fire so vast it could only be fed by a truly enormous devotion to learning, built patiently over centuries by people who believed knowledge was worth gathering in such abundance. Whatever you've gathered and built in your own life, slowly, over years, carries that same quiet weight of devotion, even if no one else ever sees the whole of it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Centuries before Nalanda burned, a very different kind of destruction had already taught the ancient world a hard lesson about the fragility of gathered knowledge. In 213 BCE, China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, ordered the burning of a great many books throughout his empire, seeking to control the historical record and eliminate rival schools of thought, sparing mainly texts on medicine, agriculture, and divination. It was one of the earliest recorded instances of a ruler attempting to erase a civilization's memory on purpose, rather than losing it to fire or time by accident. And yet, in the centuries that followed, scholars of the Han Dynasty worked patiently to reconstruct what had been lost, gathering surviving fragments and oral memories, slowly rebuilding an imperial library from the scattered pieces that remained. There's a quiet resilience in that rebuilding. The idea that even deliberate, intentional loss does not always have the final word. That patient people, working slowly, can gather the pieces back together again. Whatever feels lost or erased in your own memory tonight doesn't need to be whole right now. It can simply wait patiently to be gathered again in its own time. But that is only one small part of the story. Nearly 2,000 years after Qin, Shi Huang's fires, a hidden chamber in the far western deserts of China revealed one of the great accidental libraries of the ancient world. In 1900, a Taoist monk caring for a complex of Buddhist cave temples near Dunhuang discovered a sealed chamber, hidden behind a wall for roughly 900 years, containing tens of thousands of manuscripts and paintings, religious texts, business contracts, poems, and star charts, written in numerous languages by travelers and monks along the Silk Road. No one knows for certain why the room was sealed in the first place, whether for protection from invasion or simply as a quiet, unremarkable act of storage that was later forgotten. Either way, an entire cross-section of Silk Road life sat undisturbed in the dark for 9 centuries, waiting. There's something wonderful in imagining a library that survived not through grand protection, but through the simple, humble act of being forgotten, tucked away, and left alone long enough for the danger outside to pass entirely. Whatever feels tucked away and forgotten in you tonight is not lost. It is only resting, waiting for its own quiet, unhurried moment to be found again. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. While China's hidden library waited in darkness, another great library stood in plain sight for over 1,000 years, quietly enduring almost everything history could throw at it. The Imperial Library of Constantinople, founded in the 4th century CE, held countless works of Greek and Roman literature and scholarship, surviving wars, fires, and the long, slow transformation of an empire century after century, in a way almost no other ancient library managed. It is thanks largely to this library and to the scribes who worked within it that many ancient Greek texts survive today at all copied and preserved through a period when much of the rest of the old Mediterranean world had already lost its written memory. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, whatever remained of the library was scattered. But by then, so many of its texts had already been copied and carried elsewhere that its long labor of preservation had, in a sense, already succeeded. There's a kind of patient triumph in that, not a dramatic, single victory, but a long, unglamorous 1,000-year effort that quietly worked, bit by bit, without anyone needing to declare it a success along the way. Whatever quiet, unglamorous effort you've been making in your own life doesn't need applause tonight either. It is working, slowly, whether or not it feels that way. There is something else worth letting settle for a moment. At Ephesus, on the western coast of what is now Turkey, a library was built not simply to hold books, but to hold the memory of a single beloved man. The Library of Celsus, completed around 117 CE, was commissioned by a son in honor of his father, a Roman senator named Tiberius Julius Celsus Polmianus. And remarkably, Celsus himself was buried in a decorated tomb beneath the library floor, resting quietly beneath the very shelves built to honor his memory. The library's grand 2-story facade, carved with statues representing wisdom, knowledge, intelligence, and virtue, still stands today, one of the most beautiful ruins of the ancient world, even though the scrolls it once held have long since disappeared. A library, in this case, was not simply a place to store knowledge. It was a monument, a way of saying that a person's love of learning could outlive the person entirely. There is something quietly moving in that gesture, building a room full of books as a way of saying, permanently, that someone mattered, that their curiosity deserved to be remembered in stone. Whoever has shaped the person you've become tonight, through some quiet gift of knowledge or patience, is still resting somewhere inside you, the way Celsus rests beneath his own library floor. But that is only one small part of the story. Long before Alexandria or Pergamon, in a city on the coast of what is now Syria, scribes were already keeping careful records, using one of the earliest alphabets ever devised. At Ugarit, tablets dating back more than 3,000 years preserve not only administrative records and myths, but also one of the oldest known abecedaries, a simple, orderly list of the alphabet itself, written out the way a student today might practice their letters. It is a strangely intimate thing to find among the ruins of a Bronze Age library, not a grand epic or a royal decree, but a scribe patiently practicing the shape of each letter, over and over, the same quiet repetition every beginner has ever needed. There's something comforting in that image, knowledge, even at its most ancient, starting the exact same humble way it starts for anyone today, one careful letter at a time. Whatever you're still learning, however slowly, however unfinished it feels tonight, is being built the same patient way every letter of every alphabet ever was. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Ancient libraries were often built with a very particular relationship to the sun. Long before anyone understood why sunlight could be dangerous to old materials, many Roman libraries, including sections of grand complexes like the libraries built within Trajan's Forum, were designed to face east, catching the gentler morning light rather than the harsher glare of afternoon sun, which could fade ink and dry out fragile papyrus and parchment. Reading rooms were often kept relatively small and enclosed, protecting scrolls from damp, from direct light, from the kind of temperature swings that could warp and crack ancient materials over time. Even without fully understanding the science behind it, ancient builders seemed to sense, through centuries of trial and error, that memory needed to be kept somewhere gentle. There is something tender in that instinct, treating fragile, precious things not with force, but with careful, deliberate softness, angled just right to protect what mattered most. Whatever feels fragile in you tonight deserves that same gentle angling, away from anything too harsh, towards something calmer instead. But that is only one small part of the story. The great libraries of Rome were often built in pairs, quietly reflecting the two languages the Roman world lived inside. Public libraries, such as the Bibliotheca Ulpia, built as part of Trajan's Forum in the early 2nd century CE, were frequently constructed as twin buildings, one wing holding Greek texts, the other holding Latin, standing side by side like two halves of the same mind. Rome, after all, considered itself the inheritor of Greek culture, even as it built something distinctly its own, and its libraries physically embodied that inheritance. Two languages, two traditions, housed under matching roofs, in careful, deliberate balance. There's something quietly satisfying in that architecture. Two different histories, honored equally, standing beside each other without either one needing to dominate the other. Whatever two versions of yourself feel in tension tonight, the tired one and the curious one, perhaps, can rest just as easily side by side in their own matching, unhurried rooms. There is something else worth letting settle for a moment. Somewhere in the crowded, humming streets of ancient Alexandria, the person most responsible for a scroll's survival was often someone whose name would never appear on it at all. Behind every philosopher, poet, and astronomer whose work survived from antiquity stood an enormous, mostly invisible labor force of scribes, some free, many enslaved, whose entire days were spent copying text by hand, line after line, hour after hour, so that a single fragile original might exist in dozens of durable copies scattered across the ancient world. A scribe's hand might ache by midday. Ink might smudge. A single missed word could ripple forward through every future copy made from that flawed one. And yet, this slow, repetitive, physically demanding work is the reason so much of what we know from antiquity survived at all. Not because any one scroll was indestructible, but because enough patient hands multiplied it before time could catch up. Historians have found that when a text existed only in one or two copies, it almost always vanished eventually. It was the sheer, quiet redundancy of countless anonymous scribes, copying and copying again, that gave ideas any real chance of outliving their authors. There is something both humbling and strangely comforting in that fact. So much of what we now call ancient wisdom survived not because of a single brilliant mind, but because of thousands of unnamed, unheralded people who simply sat, day after day, doing careful, repetitive work that no one would ever thank them for individually. Tonight, whatever quiet, repetitive care you've given to your own life, the small daily things nobody notices or applauds, is doing something similar. It is multiplying, invisibly, the chances that whatever matters in you will carry forward. But that is only one small part of the story. Long before Ashurbanipal's tablets were rediscovered in the sands of Iraq, an entire language had gone silent for over 2,000 years. Its wedge-shaped writing sitting, untranslated and unreadable, in museum drawers across Europe. Cuneiform script, the writing system used across Mesopotamia for thousands of years, had become a complete mystery by the modern era. Nobody alive still knew how to read it. It took decades of painstaking work by 19th century scholars, comparing the same royal inscriptions carved in multiple languages on cliffsides in Persia, slowly matching symbol to sound, sound to word, word to meaning, before cuneiform could be read again at all. When it finally was, an entire library that had sat silent since Ashurbanipal's reign, nearly 2,500 years earlier, suddenly began speaking again, tablet by tablet, myth by myth, medical remedy by medical remedy, as if a very old, very patient voice had simply been waiting the entire time to be understood. There is something almost magical in that reawakening, a library that did not lose its words at all, only its listeners, patiently outlasting the silence until someone finally learned to hear it again. Whatever in you has gone quiet or unspoken for a while doesn't need to stay that way forever. Somewhere, eventually, in its own unhurried time, it may find someone ready to listen. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. the scholars of ancient Alexandria did not only preserve old ideas, some of them built entirely new machines, decades and sometimes centuries ahead of their time, almost as a form of play. Hero of Alexandria, working in the library's tradition centuries after its founding, designed an astonishing range of devices. A simple steam-powered sphere that spun when heated, coin-operated dispensers for holy water in temples. Automatic doors that appeared to open on their own using hidden mechanisms of weights and fire, and even primitive wind-powered organs. None of these inventions sparked an industrial revolution. They were largely built as curiosities, temple novelties, or demonstrations of clever engineering, admired more as delightful puzzles than as practical tools. And yet the principles behind them, quietly recorded and passed down through careful copying, would eventually echo many centuries later in engines and machines their inventor could never have imagined. There's something delightful in that image, a brilliant mind, centuries ahead of its moment, building marvels simply because building them was interesting, without needing them to change the world right away. Whatever small, curious, seemingly impractical thing your own mind wonders about tonight doesn't need a purpose either. It can simply exist, quietly clever, resting in the dark until its own time comes. There is something else worth letting settle for a moment. There is a strange comfort in knowing that ancient readers worried about theft in almost exactly the way we might worry about losing something precious today. And their solution was to ask the universe itself for help. Many ancient manuscripts, especially in monastic libraries of the medieval world, but also stretching back into antiquity, carried what scholars now call book curses, short warnings written into the front or back pages, threatening consequences for anyone who stole, damaged, or failed to return a borrowed text. Some were gentle, simply asking that the book be treated with care and returned to its rightful shelf. Others were dramatic and vivid, invoking illness, misfortune, or the displeasure of the gods upon anyone careless enough to mistreat the pages. A single copy of a text, in a world without printing presses, represented weeks or months of a scribe's labor. And losing it might mean losing an idea entirely, forever, with no backup anywhere else in the world. These curses were not mere superstition so much as a kind of desperate insurance policy, written by people who understood, more acutely than we often do today, just how fragile and irreplaceable a single copy of anything really was. There is something almost touching in that fierce, slightly anxious protectiveness, the sense that an idea, once lost, might never return, and so it deserved to be guarded the way you might guard something irreplaceable and dear. Whatever irreplaceable thing you're quietly protecting in your own life tonight, a memory, a relationship, a fragile hope, deserves that same fierce, gentle guarding. You don't need a curse to protect it. You only need to keep holding it softly, the way you already have been. But that is only one small part of the story. The very first head librarian of Alexandria may have owed his position not to scholarship alone, but to being, quite simply, in the right city at the right time, tutoring the right child. Zenodotus of Ephesus, believed to be the library's first chief librarian in the early 3rd century BCE, is credited with organizing the vast early collection and beginning the long tradition of comparing different versions of Homer's poems to establish more reliable texts. After him came a long line of scholar librarians: Eratosthenes, the geographer, Aristophanes of Byzantium, who developed early punctuation, marks to help readers know where to pause and breathe while reading aloud, and Aristarchus of Samothrace, famous for his exhaustive commentary on Homeric poetry. Each of these librarians left the collection a little more organized, a little more carefully studied, a little more useful to the scholar who would inherit it next. An unbroken relay of careful stewardship stretching across generations. There's something quietly moving in that relay. No single person building the whole thing alone, but each caretaker doing their patient part before handing the collection gently onward to the next. Whatever quiet work you've done today, however small, however unfinished it feels, is also part of a relay. You don't have to finish everything tonight. You only have to set it down gently, ready to be picked up again tomorrow. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. If you had walked into the reading rooms of an ancient library, almost anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world, the first thing you likely would have noticed was not silence, but a low, steady murmur, the sound of dozens of people reading quietly aloud to themselves at once. For most of antiquity, reading was rarely a fully silent act the way it often is today. Written Greek and Latin texts were commonly composed without spaces between words, and readers frequently sounded out syllables under their breath, simply to make sense of where one word ended and another began. Whole rooms of scholars, students, and casual readers might sit shoulder to shoulder, each murmuring their own separate text at their own separate pace. 100 quiet, overlapping voices filling the same stone hall, none of them quite listening to any of the others, and yet somehow forming together a single low hum of shared attention. Silent reading did exist and was noted with a kind of mild surprise when observed, but it was the exception rather than the rule. To read, for most people in the ancient world, was to speak softly to yourself, to feel the words moving through your own mouth and breath before they ever reached your understanding. There is something wonderfully intimate in imagining that sound, not the hush we associate with libraries today, but instead something closer to a gentle, wordless choir. Dozens of private thoughts murmured softly into a shared, patient room. If your own mind is murmuring quietly to itself tonight, turning some soft thought over and over without needing to reach any conclusion, that murmur belongs to a very old and very human tradition. You don't need to read anything silently or perfectly tonight. You can simply let your thoughts move like breath, softly, at their own unhurried pace, until they finally settle. There is something else worth letting settle for a moment. Long after Alexandria's original grandeur had faded, a smaller companion library elsewhere in the same city quietly outlived it by centuries. Tucked inside the walls of a temple, most visitors came to see for entirely different reasons. The Serapeum of Alexandria, a grand temple complex dedicated to the god Serapis, is believed by many historians to have housed what was sometimes called a daughter library, a secondary collection connected to, but distinct from, the main library at the Mausoleum, serving as both a religious sanctuary and a scholarly resource in its own right. While the Mausoleum's fortunes rose and fell with royal patronage and political upheaval, the Serapeum persisted quietly for centuries longer, a temple first and a library second, its shelves protected almost incidentally by the sanctity of the space around them. It was not until 391 CE, amid religious conflict, that the Serapeum itself was finally destroyed, closing one of the very last living threads connecting the ancient world directly back to Alexandria's original golden age of scholarship. There is something quietly poignant in that slow persistence. A smaller, humbler space, never as celebrated as its famous sibling, simply continuing on, patiently, long after the more famous version of itself had already faded from memory. Whatever quiet, humble part of your own life continues on steadily, without much fanfare or attention, deserves just as much rest and care tonight as anything more celebrated. Steadiness, after all, is its own kind of quiet triumph. But that is only one small part of the story. The very shape of a library shelf, the specific system by which one scroll sat beside another, quietly reveals what an ancient civilization believed was worth remembering in the first place. At Nineveh, Ashurbanipal's collectors did not simply hoard everything indiscriminately. They organized tablets by subject in ways that reveal the priorities of Assyrian intellectual life. Omens and divination filled entire sections, as did medicine, astronomy, grammar, and the great literary epics, including what remains the oldest known epic poem in human history, the story of Gilgamesh, a king who set out on an impossible journey to escape death itself, only to return home having learned to accept his own mortality. It is a strange and moving thing to imagine that one of the very first stories ever written down was already, thousands of years ago, wrestling with the exact same fear that quietly visits almost everyone at some point in a dark, quiet room at night. The fear of ending, of being forgotten, of time moving forward without us. And yet, the story of Gilgamesh does not end in despair. It ends with the king walking the walls of his own city, finding a kind of peace in what he had built, in the community he would leave behind, in the ordinary continuity of life carrying on. There's a quiet grace in that ending, especially considering how old the story is, nearly 4,000 years of readers, one after another, finding some small comfort in the same simple lesson. You do not need to solve mortality tonight, or anything nearly so large. You only need to let yourself rest inside the ordinary continuity of your own life, trusting, the way Gilgamesh finally did, that what you've built and loved will carry quietly onward regardless. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Some of the objects that ended up shaping how we understand ancient libraries were never meant to be read by anyone at all. They were simply meant to keep count. Long before writing itself existed, small clay tokens shaped like cones, spheres, and discs were used across ancient Mesopotamia to track quantities of grain, livestock, and goods, sealed inside hollow clay envelopes as a kind of tamper-proof record. Some researchers believe that the practice of pressing these tokens into the outside of the wet clay envelope to show what was sealed within without needing to break it open may have been one of the very first steps toward the invention of writing itself, a picture standing in for a thing, and eventually a picture standing in for a sound. In other words, the impulse that eventually filled the great libraries of the ancient world with poetry, medicine, and myth may have started as something almost absurdly practical. A farmer somewhere, simply trying to remember how many sheep he owned. There's something wonderfully humbling in that origin story. The vast intellectual inheritance of libraries beginning not with philosophy or wonder, but with something as ordinary and unglamorous as counting livestock, patiently, one clay token at a time. Whatever ordinary, unglamorous task filled your own day today, know that even the grandest things, libraries, stories, whole civilizations of memory, often begin from exactly that kind of humble, patient beginning. There is something else worth letting settle for a moment. Not every reader in the ancient world entered a library through its front doors. Some entered through its walls, quite literally. Centuries after the building itself had already crumbled into ruin. Archaeologists studying ancient library sites have sometimes found scrolls and tablets reused as building material, packed into walls as insulation, or buried beneath later structures entirely by chance. Their contents unknown to the very people who unknowingly built on top of them. A farmer plowing a field, a mason repairing a wall, a builder laying a new foundation. Any of them might unknowingly disturb, protect, or destroy a fragment of ancient memory without ever realizing what lay beneath their hands. Entire portions of what we now know about the ancient world have survived not through careful preservation, but through pure, unplanned accident. A scroll dropped into a rubbish pit that happened to be sealed by dry sand. A tablet used to level an uneven floor. A fragment tucked into a wall simply because it happened to be the right size and shape for the job. There's something quietly reassuring in that randomness. The idea that meaning and memory can survive not only through grand, deliberate effort, but sometimes through pure accident, patiently waiting in the most unlikely, unremarkable places. Whatever feels scattered or accidental about your own day today doesn't need to be perfectly arranged to matter. Sometimes the most important things survive precisely because no one tried too hard to protect them. But that is only one small part of the story. There is a particular kind of vastness worth pausing on here, a way of holding the whole of this evening's subject at once, the way you might hold something large and warm in cupped hands. Every library we've wandered through tonight, Nineveh, Alexandria, Pergamon, Nalanda, Timbuktu, Constantinople, existed for what is, on the scale of the universe, a single breath. The stone from which their walls were built had already been sitting quietly on earth for billions of years before any human hand ever shaped it into a doorway. The papyrus reeds that became scrolls grew from soil made of ancient, decayed forests, and even older stardust, the same slow cosmic material that eventually became rivers and bones and ink and the very fingers that once turned a scroll's fragile edge. Above every one of those libraries, whether burning or thriving or slowly crumbling into dust, the same steady, patient sky kept turning, indifferent and calm, exactly as it is turning above you right now. Civilizations rise, gather their careful shelves of memory, and eventually fade. And the universe simply continues on, unhurried, the way it always has, the way it always will. There's something enormous and strangely very comforting in that scale. Whatever feels large or urgent in your life tonight is, in the truest sense, held gently inside something impossibly larger and calmer than itself. A universe that has already witnessed libraries rise and fall more times than we could ever count, and continues steadily, regardless. You don't need to carry tonight's weight alone. It is already being held by something vast enough to hold anything at all. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Among the countless texts once housed in ancient libraries, one particular kind of writing quietly reveals just how emotionally invested ancient readers were in the stories they collected. Fragments of ancient reader annotations, small marginal notes scratched by hand alongside a copied text, occasionally survive, offering brief, startlingly human glimpses into how these old readers actually felt while reading. A margin might carry a short note expressing agreement, disagreement, admiration for a particularly elegant turn of phrase, or simple weary complaint about a passage that felt tedious to copy on a long afternoon. These marginal whispers, scratched centuries ago by scribes and scholars who never imagined a future reader might find them, remind us that ancient libraries were never simply cold repositories of dusty fact. They were full of real people, sitting with real feelings, responding personally to words that moved them, bored them, delighted them, exactly the way words still do today. There is something quietly lovely in imagining those small, private reactions surviving across so many centuries, proof that curiosity, boredom, delight, and admiration have always felt like this, unchanged in every reader across every age. Whatever you feel tonight, drifting through these old stories, joins a very long line of readers before you who felt something similar, scratched quietly into a margin, and simply moved on with their evening. There is something else worth letting settle for a moment. The Library of Pergamon, for all its fame as Alexandria's great rival, is remembered today almost entirely through the words of other people, since almost nothing of the library itself survived into the present. Ancient writers described its collection as vast, rumored by some later sources to have held around 200,000 scrolls, housed within a hilltop citadel overlooking the city below. Its reading rooms built with clever gaps behind the shelves to let air circulate and protect the scrolls from the damp that could otherwise warp and ruin them. Mark Antony is said to have later given the entire collection to Cleopatra as a gift, meant to help replenish Alexandria's library after a fire had damaged part of its holdings. One great library, in effect, quietly saving another, rival cities reaching across old competition to help repair what fire had taken. Whether every detail of that story is precisely accurate is still debated, the way so many details from this era remain frustratingly uncertain, pieced together from fragments, rumors, and the occasional archaeological trace. But the underlying gesture, true or not, has endured for 2,000 years regardless. One library, in its moment of need, receiving help from the very rival it had spent so long trying to outshine. There's something quietly hopeful in that story. However uncertain its details remain, the idea that even fierce old rivalries can soften, eventually, into something more like care. Whatever old rivalry or tension you're carrying tonight, in your own mind or your own relationships, doesn't need to stay sharp forever. It, too, can soften slowly, the way old stone softens under centuries of gentle rain. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Very quietly, in recent decades, a kind of second life has begun for some of these ancient libraries, built not from clay or papyrus, but from careful digital light. Researchers have spent years photographing, scanning, and digitally reconstructing fragments from Ashurbanipal's library, the Dunhuang cave manuscripts, and the carbonized Herculaneum scrolls, piecing together images and translations so that anyone, anywhere, with a quiet evening and an internet connection, can now look at the same careful handwriting a Sumerian scribe once pressed into wet clay, or read a fragment a monk in Dunhuang tucked away 9 centuries ago. In a strange, gentle way, these old libraries are being rebuilt all over again, not by kings this time, or emperors, or wealthy patrons, but by patient teams of researchers working slowly, image by image, translation by translation, giving these old, quiet voices a new, unexpected kind of permanence. There's something moving in that continuity, the same old impulse, the same old care, simply wearing new clothes, still trying, all these thousands of years later, to keep something fragile from disappearing. Whatever fragile hope you're quietly protecting tonight is part of that same very old, very human effort. It is allowed to be slow. It is allowed to take its time. There is something else, quieter now, worth resting on. Some scrolls in ancient libraries carried a very simple kind of signature at their very end. A scribe's own name, quietly tucked into the final line. These closing notes, called colophons, often recorded who had copied the text, and sometimes when, and occasionally even how tired the scribe felt by the final page. One surviving colophon complains gently about eye strain from the lamplight. Another simply says the work is finished and gives thanks for it. There is something small and lovely in that. A person closing their work for the night, leaving behind the tiniest trace of themselves. Whatever you finish tonight, even quietly, even unnoticed, deserves that same small, gentle closing. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Not every library needed walls at all. Nomadic and semi-nomadic scholars across parts of the ancient and medieval world sometimes carried their libraries with them. Small, portable collections of texts, wrapped carefully, and moved from place to place. A library reduced to whatever could be gently carried. There is something quietly freeing in that image. A library made small enough to hold. A whole tradition of memory, folded and carried gently wherever it needed to go. Whatever you're carrying tonight doesn't need a permanent place either. It can simply travel with you softly until it finds its rest. There is something else worth letting settle for a moment. Ancient Chinese imperial libraries developed a quiet, careful custom, storing duplicate copies of important texts in separate buildings, sometimes separate cities entirely, so that no single fire could ever take everything at once. This habit, born from painful experience with earlier losses, meant that knowledge was never resting in only one place, spread gently across distance, so that distance itself became a kind of protection. There is something comforting in that. The idea that safety sometimes comes not from a single strong wall, but from simply not putting everything in one place. Whatever matters most to you tonight is likely held in more than one place too, in memory, in habit, in the people who know you. It is safer than it feels. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over any very old place. And ancient libraries, even in their prime, seem to have carried some version of that stillness, even while they were bustling with scholars and scribes. Visitors' accounts from antiquity describe Alexandria's Mausian not as a loud, chaotic place, but as something closer to a quiet retreat. Covered walkways where scholars strolled slowly while thinking, shaded gardens meant for unhurried conversation, a dining hall where philosophers and poets ate together without rushing through their meals. The whole complex seems to have been designed less like a busy modern office and more like a place built specifically to protect slowness, to give brilliant, restless minds permission to simply wander without urgency toward whatever idea was quietly waiting for them. There is something worth borrowing from that design tonight. You don't need urgency either. You are allowed to simply wander slowly through whatever thought is quietly waiting for you without needing to arrive anywhere at all. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Quieter now. Even kings, it turns out, sometimes needed permission to rest their own minds inside a library. Ancient sources describe rulers visiting their own libraries not to conduct business, but simply to sit, to read, to be quietly alone with a scroll for an hour, away from the noise of court and decision-making that filled the rest of their days. A library, even for the most powerful people in the ancient world, was sometimes simply a room to become smaller in, to set down the weight of being important for a little while, and just be a person turning a page. Whatever role you carry through your own days, however much weight you hold for other people, you are allowed tonight to set all of it down. You don't need to be anything right now. You can simply rest, the way even kings once did, quietly, with nothing to prove. There is something else, softer now, worth resting on. There is one detail about ancient libraries that is easy to overlook entirely. And yet, it may be the quietest, truest thing about all of them. Nearly every library we've wandered through tonight eventually lost most of what it once held. Of Alexandria's staggering collection, once estimated at hundreds of thousands of scrolls, only fragments and second-hand descriptions remain today. Of Pergamon's rival collection, almost nothing survives directly at all. Of Nalanda's vast halls of manuscripts, only scattered pieces and later accounts remain to tell us what was lost. This is, in its own way, simply what happens to almost everything, given enough time. Paper crumbles, empires fall, fires happen, floods happen, forgetting happens, gently or suddenly, and eventually happens to nearly everything that has ever existed. And yet, somehow, this is not really a sad story tonight, because something did survive. Enough survived. Fragment here, a copy there, an idea passed carefully from one patient hand to the next. Enough for us to still be able to imagine these places clearly enough tonight to visit them together. All these thousands of years later, in the quiet dark. Loss, it turns out, is not always the opposite of survival. Sometimes it is simply the space around what did, quietly, make it through. Whatever you feel you've lost, or are afraid of losing, whatever slips gently out of your hands despite your best care, know that loss and survival have always traveled together, in libraries and in lives. Something of what matters most in you will make it through, quietly, the way a single fragment of Sappho's poetry or a single tablet of Gilgamesh made it all the way here, into this very room tonight. There is something else, very soft now, worth resting on. Above every one of these old libraries, whether they burned in a single terrible night or simply faded, slowly, over centuries of neglect, the same patient sky kept its steady watch. The stars that ancient astronomers in Nineveh once tracked so carefully, cataloging their movements onto careful tablets, are largely the very same stars quietly turning above you right now, tonight, whether or not the sky where you are happens to be visible through cloud or curtain. Time moves differently for stars than it does for us. What feels impossibly ancient to a human life? Thousands of years, dozens of collapsed empires, entire libraries built and lost and rebuilt, is to the universe, closer to the space between one slow breath and the next. You are held tonight inside that same vast, unhurried patience. Whatever feels urgent or unfinished can wait, gently, inside a scale of time large enough to hold it without strain. The stars kept their steady watch over Nineveh's burning and Alexandria's slow fading, and Nalanda's long silence. They are keeping that same steady watch over you now, asking nothing of you at all, except, perhaps, to finally rest. There is something else, quieter still, worth letting go of now. Before we let this evening's wandering settle fully into rest, there is one more quiet thread worth following. The strange, tender fact that ancient libraries were rarely finished. Alexandria's collection grew for centuries, never reaching some final, completed state, always simply larger tomorrow than it had been today. Scroll after scroll after scroll, an unfinished project by its very nature. Nineveh's tablets kept arriving from every corner of the Assyrian Empire, gathered continuously, right up until the very end. No ancient librarian ever stood in their reading room and declared the collection complete, the work finished, the shelves as full as they would ever need to be. A library, it turns out, was never really a finished object at all. It was closer to a slow, ongoing conversation. One generation quietly adding its own careful sentence, then handing the unfinished page to the next. There's something enormously freeing in that, if you let it settle for a moment. You don't need to finish anything tonight either. Nothing about today needs to be complete, wrapped up, resolved before you're allowed to rest. You are simply handing an unfinished page gently onward to tomorrow, the way every library in this story always did, patiently, without ever needing to call itself done. There is something else, very soft now, worth letting settle, long before Alexandria's fame, and long after its slow fading. Small local libraries and archives, dotted quietly across the ancient world in places history barely remembers by name. Provincial towns, minor temples, modest households that simply kept a small shelf of texts because someone in that particular place, at some particular time, cared enough to gather them. These were never grand. No poet wrote odes to them. No king boasted of their size. And yet, multiplied across thousands of small, forgotten towns and centuries of quiet, ordinary people, these small local collections held together an enormous, invisible web of memory, far larger in total than any single famous library ever was on its own. Grandeur, it turns out, was never really the thing that mattered most. Quiet, ordinary continuity was. Whatever ordinary, unremarkable care you've given to something small in your own life, a habit, a hobby, a shelf of half-read books by your bed, matters in that same quiet, cumulative way. You don't need to be Alexandria. Being a small, steady, ordinary keeper of something you love is enough. It always was. There is something else, quieter still. Something worth resting on, gently, before we begin to close. Ancient scribes sometimes worked through the night themselves, copying by oil lamp, the small flickering light, the only thing between their careful hand and total darkness. A colophon from a tired scribe once noted, simply, that the lamp had nearly gone out before the final line was finished. A tiny human detail tucked at the edge of something much larger. That scribe, working alone in low light, copying someone else's ancient words so a future stranger could read them, was doing something remarkably close to what is happening right now, in whatever quiet room you're resting in. A voice, low and unhurried, carrying old words gently through the dark, so that something tired might finally rest. There is something else, softer still, worth resting on. Ancient Egyptian scribes were sometimes buried with small tools of their trade: a reed pen, a palette for grinding ink, small and humble objects meant to travel with them into whatever came next. It suggests something quietly moving about how these people saw their own work. Not simply a job to leave behind at the end of a life, but something worth carrying even further into the unknown, into whatever rest waited on the other side. Whatever quiet work has shaped your own life, whatever small, patient thing you've carried carefully for years, is allowed to rest beside you tonight too, the way a scribe's reed pen once rested quietly beside its owner, needing nothing more to prove. There is something else, very soft now. Even the very word library carries a small, quiet history worth pausing on. It comes from the Latin liber, meaning the inner bark of a tree, once used as an early writing surface long before papyrus or parchment became common. Somewhere in that word, buried gently inside every library that has ever existed, is a tree, patient, slow-growing, quietly offering its own inner layers so that memory might have somewhere soft to rest. You, too, are made of slow, patient layers, quietly built over years, quietly holding more than anyone else could ever fully read. Tonight, none of those layers need to be read or understood. They only need to rest, the way old bark rests around an old, steady tree, unhurried, exactly as it is. There is nothing else to add now, only quiet. There is one final thread worth following before we let the whole evening rest, and it has to do with something almost nobody asks about ancient libraries: who actually got to walk through their doors. Access to the greatest libraries of antiquity was rarely open to everyone. Alexandria's Mausian primarily welcomed scholars invited or sponsored by the royal court, a privileged circle of thinkers supported by wealth and connection, rather than a public institution in the way we might imagine a library today. Many ordinary people in the ancient world, farmers, laborers, merchants, would never have set foot inside such a place, would never have unrolled one of its scrolls, would never have breathed its cedar-scented air even once in an entire lifetime. And yet, slowly, over centuries, something did begin to shift. Roman public libraries, unlike Alexandria's more exclusive Mausian, were built deliberately for wider civic use, often attached to bath complexes and forums, where ordinary citizens already gathered, tucked into the rhythm of everyday city life rather than sealed away behind royal privilege. It was a slow, imperfect, gradual widening, knowledge inching, generation by generation, a little closer to everyone, rather than remaining the quiet property of the very few. There's something worth sitting within that slow widening, imperfect as it was. The impulse to gather memory and protect it began, so often in narrow, guarded rooms. And yet across centuries, that same impulse kept quietly pressing outward toward more open doors, more shared shelves, more voices welcome inside. Whatever door in your own life once felt closed to you, whatever room you once weren't sure you belonged in, know that doors, slowly, unglamorously, have always tended to widen, given enough patient time. There is something else, softer now, worth resting on before we close. If you have made it this far tonight, awake or drifting somewhere between waking and sleep, you have wandered through nearly 4,000 years of shelves together at your own unhurried pace. You've walked past clay tablets baking slowly in an accidental fire that saved them instead of destroying them. You've stood in a sunlit Alexandrian courtyard where a librarian once measured the whole round earth using nothing but a shadow and patient thought. You've smelled cedar oil and old dust in a temple library calling itself the healing place of the soul. You've heard the low, overlapping murmur of 100 ancient readers, each speaking their own private words softly into a shared, patient room. None of it needed to be remembered perfectly. None of it was ever a test. What remains now is simply this: a tired mind, gently occupied for a while, slowly loosening its grip on the sharper edges of today, ready, finally, to rest. There is something else worth resting on for a moment before the very last stretch of quiet begins. Ancient Alexandria did not only translate Greek works for its own scholars, it also became home to one of the most significant acts of translation in the ancient world, when, according to tradition, 72 Jewish scholars were brought to the city to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. The resulting text, later known as the Septuagint, allowed Greek-speaking Jewish communities scattered across the Mediterranean, who no longer read Hebrew fluently, to access their own sacred texts in the language of their daily lives. It also meant that, centuries later, early Christian communities, themselves largely Greek-speaking, encountered these scriptures for the first time through this very translation. A single library project in Alexandria, quietly shaping religious and cultural history for thousands of years afterward, in ways those original 72 scholars could never have imagined as they worked. There's something remarkable in that ripple effect, a careful, patient act of translation, undertaken to help one community read its own inherited words a little more easily, eventually reaching so much further than anyone at the time could have guessed. Whatever quiet, careful thing you do today, however small it feels, might carry further than you can currently imagine too. You don't need to know how far. You only need to do the small, careful thing in front of you. There is something else, very quiet now, worth resting on. Ancient libraries occasionally kept careful records, not just of the texts they held, but of the readers who borrowed them. Small ledgers noting who had taken which scroll, and when it was expected back. A quiet, ordinary bureaucracy of trust threaded through even the grandest halls of learning. There is something comforting in that ordinariness. The idea that even history's most legendary libraries were, underneath all their grandeur, still just rooms full of ordinary human systems, ordinary trust, ordinary people quietly keeping track of each other's borrowed things. Grand as they were still, at their core, simply places built on people trusting each other gently with something fragile. Whatever trust you've extended today, quietly, without fanfare, matters in that same ordinary, essential way. You don't need grandeur to matter. You only need the quiet willingness to hold something carefully and to give it back gently when it's time. Long before anyone could become a scholar, a poet, or a librarian in the ancient world, they first had to sit, very young, in a small mud brick room and learn to copy the same handful of signs over and over until their hand stopped shaking. In ancient Sumer, these schools were called edaba, literally tablet houses. And archaeologists have recovered thousands of practice tablets from their floors. A teacher's model text on one side, a student's clumsy, effortful copy on the other, sometimes smoothed over and reused several times in a single day as clay was pressed flat and started fresh. Discipline could be strict. Surviving school texts complain, half humorously, about students being scolded, about the long hours, about how tiring it was to sit still and copy the same lines again and again until they were right. And yet, from these humble, repetitive, occasionally miserable classrooms came the very scribes who would go on to fill the great archives and libraries of Mesopotamia for thousands of years afterward. Every epic, every medical text, every careful omen catalog we've wandered through tonight began, in some very literal sense, in a tired child's unsteady handwriting, slowly steadying with practice. There's something quietly reassuring in that origin, the idea that even the grandest, most impressive collections of ancient wisdom began with ordinary, unglamorous practice, repeated patiently, until it became something steady and sure. Whatever you are still practicing in your own life, however unsteady it still feels tonight, is allowed to simply keep practicing gently without needing to be perfect yet. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Not every library came to its city peacefully. Some arrived as the spoils of war, carried home the way a conquering army might carry home gold or statues. In 168 BCE, after defeating the Macedonian king Perseus, the Roman general Aemilius Paulus is said to have brought the royal library of Macedon back to Rome as war booty, granting his own sons access to its Greek texts as part of their education. It was one of the earliest recorded moments of a substantial Greek library being physically transferred into Roman hands. A small, quiet seed of what would later become Rome's own deep fascination with Greek learning, philosophy, and literature. Conquest, in this case, carried an unexpected cargo, not just weapons and wealth, but ideas, quietly folded into crates, waiting to take root somewhere entirely new. There is something worth sitting within that strange transfer. How even violent, difficult histories sometimes carry forward something unexpectedly generative, an idea finding new soil in the most unlikely way. Whatever difficult chapter is part of your own history tonight, know that something worthwhile can still, eventually, take root from even the hardest ground. There's something else worth letting settle for a moment. Wealthy Romans, following that same fascination with Greek learning, began building private libraries of their own inside their villas. Rooms meant less for research and more for quiet, personal retreat. The statesman Cicero wrote fondly of his own library at his villa in Tusculum, describing the simple joy of being surrounded by books, of having a quiet room to retreat into after the noise and exhaustion of public life in Rome. He corresponded with friends about acquiring new texts, about organizing his shelves, about the particular comfort of a well-arranged private collection. Sentiments that would feel entirely familiar to anyone today who has ever found comfort in a favorite shelf of well-loved books. A library, for Cicero, was not simply a place of study. It was a refuge, a room built specifically for exhaling. There's something lovely in recognizing how little that particular comfort has changed across 2,000 years. A tired, overworked person finding quiet relief in a familiar room full of familiar words. Wherever your own quiet refuge is tonight, real or simply imagined, you are allowed to rest inside it now, the same unhurried way Cicero once did. There is something else, softer now, worth resting on. Not every scholar remembered from Alexandria's long tradition was a man, though history's records more often preserved the names of men. Hypatia of Alexandria, a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher working in the late 4th century CE, taught within the city's long scholarly tradition, respected by students who traveled specifically to learn from her, continuing a lineage of inquiry that stretched back. By then, more than 600 years to the library's earliest founding. Her life ended violently amid the same religious and political turmoil that also saw the destruction of the nearby Serapeum, a stark reminder that libraries and the scholars who tended them were never fully separate from the turbulent world surrounding them. And yet her name, and something of her careful, rigorous way of thinking, survived anyway, carried forward by students and later writers who refused to let her memory fade entirely. There's something quietly important in remembering her tonight. Among all these older, larger stories, a reminder that behind every grand collection of scrolls were real individual people, teaching, thinking, occasionally paying an enormous price simply for continuing to think publicly and openly. Whatever quiet thinking you do tonight and always joins a very long, resilient lineage of people who kept thinking gently, even when the world around them made it difficult. There is something else, very quiet now, worth resting on before we begin to close. Before a single word could ever be written down in Egypt, someone first had to turn a swamp plant into something a pen could glide across. And the process itself was slow, wet, and surprisingly physical. Papyrus was made from the pith of a tall reed that grew densely along the Nile's marshy banks. Workers cut the stalks, peeled away the tough outer rind, and sliced the soft inner pith into long, thin strips, laying them side by side on a flat surface, then pressing a second layer crosswise on top, the fibers running in opposite directions like a woven mat. Under pressure and time, the plant's own natural sap glued the layers together into a single sheet, which was then dried in the sun, smoothed with a stone or shell, and finally trimmed and joined edge to edge with other sheets to form a long, continuous roll. An entire scroll might require dozens of these individual sheets, painstakingly grown, cut, layered, and dried by hands that would never see their own names attached to whatever words eventually filled the finished roll. There is something grounding in tracing a scroll back to its beginning this way, not starting with a poem or a decree, but with mud, water, sunlight, and patient, repetitive labor, long before a single word existed. Whatever feels unfinished in your own life tonight is likely further along than it feels, quietly layered and pressed together already, simply still waiting for its own turn in the sun. There is something else worth letting settle for a moment. Even the most powerful conqueror in the ancient Mediterranean world, it turns out, could not fall asleep without a book close by. Ancient biographers describe Alexander the Great keeping an annotated copy of Homer's Iliad, said to have been prepared for him by his tutor Aristotle, tucked beneath his pillow each night alongside a dagger. One object for defending his body while he slept, the other It seems, for something quieter, some comfort of familiar words close at hand in the dark, in unfamiliar lands, far from anything resembling home. Whatever this particular detail owes to legend rather than strict historical record, it has endured for over 2,000 years precisely because it feels so recognizably, comfortingly human. A powerful, restless man, far from everything familiar, needing something soft and known nearby before he could finally close his eyes. There's something worth borrowing from that image tonight, however legendary its exact details might be. You too are allowed to keep something soft and familiar close by as you drift off, whether it's a story, a memory, or simply this slow, steady voice, quietly keeping you company in the dark. There is something else, softer now, worth resting on. Some of the oldest surviving medical writing in the world was not born from a doctor sitting calmly and theorizing, but from injuries, hard-won and painfully specific, carefully observed and recorded so the next healer would not have to guess. The Edwin Smith papyrus, an Egyptian medical text believed to be based on material more than 1,000 years older than the surviving copy itself, describes a series of injury cases, mostly wounds to the head and spine in careful, methodical order. Examination, diagnosis, and a frank prognosis, sometimes honestly noting that a particular injury was simply beyond treatment, an admission strikingly modern in its restraint. It reads less like myth or magic, and more like careful clinical observation, physician after physician quietly adding to a shared, growing understanding of the human body, built case by difficult case, patiently across centuries. There's something steadying in that kind of honesty, the willingness to write down not just triumphs, but limits, uncertainties, the plain truth of what could and couldn't be done. Whatever limits you're quietly carrying tonight don't need to be solved or fixed before you rest. They can simply be acknowledged, gently, the way that old, patient physician once acknowledged his own. There is something else, very quiet now, worth resting on before we begin to close. Ashurbanipal, it turns out, was almost fiercely protective of his tablets, and he made sure everyone who ever touched them knew exactly whose collection they were borrowing. Many tablets from his library at Nineveh carry a stamped inscription near the edge, identifying them as belonging to the palace of Ashurbanipal, king of the world, along with warnings directed at anyone who might remove a tablet, alter it, or fail to return it to its proper place. Threats of divine displeasure aimed squarely at careless or dishonest borrowers. It is, in its own way, an ancient king's version of a library card catalog stamp, insisting, across 26 centuries, that this particular tablet belonged here, in this particular room, and nowhere else. There's a certain fierce tenderness in that insistence, a ruler who conquered vast territories, and yet cared enough about a room full of clay to personally mark it as something worth protecting, something that mattered enough to defend even against his own guests. Whatever quiet thing you protect fiercely in your own life, a memory, a person, a private hope, is allowed that same fierce tenderness tonight. You don't need to apologize for guarding what matters to you closely. There is something else, softer now, worth resting on. Some of the largest troves of everyday ancient writing we possess today were never meant to survive at all. They were simply thrown away, forgotten in rubbish heaps on the edge of a small Egyptian town, and saved only by the accident of a very dry climate. At Oxyrhynchus, in Egypt, archaeologists uncovered enormous mounds of discarded papyrus, not treasured literary scrolls carefully preserved in a grand library, but everyday scraps, tax receipts, personal letters, shopping lists, school exercises, fragments of plays, otherwise entirely lost to history, tossed out centuries ago as simple household rubbish. Egypt's famously dry climate did what countless careful librarians elsewhere could never manage. It preserved paper by accident for 2,000 years, simply because there was too little moisture in the air and soil for it to rot away. Some of the only surviving fragments of certain ancient poems and plays exist today purely because someone, long ago, threw them in the trash in exactly the right dry corner of the world. There is something wonderfully humbling in that, the idea that what gets carefully preserved and celebrated is not always what actually survives, and what actually survives is not always what anyone intended to save. Whatever feels like discarded, unremarkable scrap in your own life tonight, an ordinary day, an unfinished thought, a small forgotten kindness, might matter far more and last far longer than you could ever guess tonight. There is something else, very quiet now, worth resting on before we begin to close. In Rome, reading was sometimes folded gently into the same part of the day set aside for bathing, resting, and easing the body. A pairing that feels, even now, remarkably wise. Grand Roman bath complexes, such as the baths of Caracalla and Trajan's baths, often included reading rooms alongside their pools, exercise courts, and steam chambers, allowing citizens to move from warm water to warm scrolls in the course of a single, unhurried afternoon. It wasn't considered strange or contradictory to pair intellectual life with physical rest. The Romans seemed to understand instinctively that a tired body and a busy mind might need soothing together in the same visit, in the same gentle rhythm of warmth and quiet. A person might soak, then stroll to the library wing, select a scroll, and read quietly for a while before returning home, their whole day gently organized around rest rather than around productivity. There is something worth borrowing from that rhythm tonight. You don't need to separate resting your body from resting your mind. They are allowed to happen together, softly, the same unhurried way a tired Roman citizen once moved from warm water to a quiet scroll on an ordinary afternoon with nowhere else they needed to be. There is something else, very quiet now, worth resting on before we begin to close. Not everyone who gathered scrolls in the ancient world did so purely out of love for reading. And even then, this was gently noticed and quietly teased. The Roman philosopher Seneca once wrote with mild amusement and a touch of real concern about wealthy Romans who filled entire rooms with beautifully bound scrolls they never actually intended to read, libraries assembled purely for show, for the appearance of learning, shelves arranged more for visiting guests to admire than for their owner to ever quietly open. Seneca suggested, gently but firmly, that a few well-loved, well-read texts mattered far more than an enormous, untouched collection gathering dust for the sake of appearances. It is, in its own way, a remarkably familiar piece of advice, echoing quietly across 2,000 years to anyone who has ever felt the pull to accumulate more than they could ever actually use, rest in, or love. There's something gently freeing in that old advice tonight. You don't need an enormous, impressive collection of anything, thoughts, achievements, unfinished plans, to feel like your day mattered. A few things, truly rested in, truly loved, are enough. They always were. There is something else, very quiet now, worth resting on before we begin to close. And now, gently, it is time to let all of this go. You don't need to hold on to any of it. Not the clay tablets of Nineveh, hardened by an accidental fire. Not the ships searched in Alexandria's harbor for scrolls they didn't yet own. Not Eratosthenes and his careful shadow, or Euclid and his patient proofs, or the 72 translators bent quietly over Hebrew scripture in a borrowed Greek city. None of it needs to stay with you, sharp and detailed, the way it might if this were something to remember for tomorrow. You can let all of it soften now, the way ink softens into paper, the way a clear thought softens into a half-formed one, and then into no thought at all. There's no need to hold any of it tightly. It will still be true quietly, whether you remember it perfectly or not at all. Let it all become impression rather than fact. A general hush of old stone and cedar and lamplight, rather than any particular name or date or number. That's enough. That was always going to be enough. You have carried tonight the weight of the whole house of life, the whole Mausian, the whole burning library of Nalanda, the whole silent chamber at Dunhuang. And now you can set every bit of it down, the way a tired scribe finally sets down a reed pen at the end of a long day. The lamp nearly gone, the final line already finished. There is nothing left to copy tonight, nothing left to catalog, to translate, to protect from insects or fire or forgetting. Whatever you needed from this evening's wandering, you already have. The rest can simply dissolve gently into whatever quiet is left of the night. Come back now, gently, to your body. Notice your breathing again, wherever it has settled. Slower now, probably, than when we began. Let your shoulders soften once more, a little further than before, sinking a little deeper into whatever is holding you right now. Let your hands rest, unclenched, wherever they happen to be. Let your face soften, your forehead, your eyes, the small muscles around your mouth that hold so much tension without ever being asked to. Let your jaw loosen again, just a little further. Let your legs grow heavy, sinking into whatever is beneath them. Let your arms grow heavy too, resting exactly where they are, with nothing left to hold on to and nothing left to reach for. There is nowhere else for any part of you to be right now, except exactly where you already are. The day is loosening its grip now too. Whatever it asked of you, whatever it demanded, whatever it left unfinished, can wait quietly exactly where it is until morning decides to ask about it again. It is not asking right now. Right now, there is only this, only breath, slow and unhurried, only stillness settling in, the way dust settles in an old, quiet room, so slowly you almost can't see it happening, until suddenly the air is simply calm. Somewhere, right now, the same old sky that watched over Nineveh's fires and Alexandria's slow fading and Nalanda's long burning is turning quietly above you too, patient and steady, exactly as it always has been. The stars Ashurbanipal's astronomers once tracked so carefully are still there, mostly unchanged, indifferent to empires, indifferent to libraries, indifferent to any of the small, urgent things that might have felt so large earlier today. Tomorrow, the sun will rise the same unhurried way it always has, the same way it rose over every reading room and every quiet scribe and every burned and rebuilt shelf we've wandered through tonight. Whatever civilization gathered these shelves, whatever hands once carried these scrolls carefully from harbor to reading room, all of it has already returned, slowly, gently, to the same patient earth that once grew the reeds and forests these libraries were built from. That return was never a tragedy. It was simply the world breathing out, the way it always eventually does. None of it needed to be hurried. None of it ever will. You don't need to finish anything tonight. You don't need to remember anything tonight. You don't even need to stay awake for the rest of this sentence if your body has already decided it's time to let go. Your body already knows how to rest. Sleep well and good night.